November 5th, 2005. Item number 102. Today's guest is Lloyd from the PSP Cast.
Podcast411.com. Listen different.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Rob, and this is the Podcast 411 Podcast. Before we get into the interview with Lloyd, a couple quick news and notes. Now, as always, if you have some feedback you'd like to leave, please call 206-666-HELP. That's 206-666-4357. Or you can send feedback to podcast411@gmail.com. And finally, you can always leave feedback in the show notes at our forum boards at podcast411.com. And speaking of show notes, in the show notes for today, I will have a link to a generic version of the end of the month promo I played at the end of our last show. So if you want to use that for your podcast, feel free to go over, download it, and use it in your show. Don't forget to check out our directory of directories, which is now at 80 different directories. We just added Vodstock, which is a video podcast directory. So please check out our directory of directories. It is probably one of the most complete lists of where you can go out and submit your podcast or your video podcasts to. Well, it's Saturday, so that means we have another tech tip from Michael. Here we go.
This is Michael Carino from DigitalMediaCastExperiment.com with another Podcast 411 tech tip. If you're not Rob from Podcast 411 with a propensity to edit out any nasty thing a guest might say, yet you don't want to be as open with your language as, say, maybe Madge Weinstein or Keith and the Girl, you may want to try bleeping your expletives. The process is quite easy. In your audio editing software, you simply need to replace the nasty language with a segment of tone. The most common is a 1000 Hz tone. In the old days, this was handy because audio producers would either have some test tone tape handy or a tone generator for testing equipment. If you want to completely protect the people from what has been said, you can bleep out the whole word from right before it starts till right after it ends. Here's an example. If you want to completely protect the from what has been said, you can bleep out the whole word from right before it till right after it. If you want to give the audience a better idea of what was actually said, yet officially bleep out the expletive, let a little bit of the beginning or the end of the word hang out, bleeping only the middle. Here's an example of that. If you want to give the audience a better idea of what was actually said, yet officially bleep out the expletive, let a little bit of the beginning or the end of the word hang out, bleeping only the middle. Carl Franklin once implied, sometimes it's actually funnier to bleep the words than leaving them bare. Thank you, for letting me your
Well, Michael, thank you for that tech tip. And as for using beeping, I just asked Madge to be a guest on the show, so hopefully we can get Madge on here shortly, and I am sure I'll need the beeping then. Per comedic effect, I think Scott Fletcher from Podcheck Review used beeping better than anyone else I've heard to date when he talked about his iRiver. For those of you that heard that episode, you know what I mean. For those of you that haven't, go back and check out all Scott's shows until you find it. Well, that's all for the news and notes. We're going to go ahead now and play a promo from the PSP Podcast, and then we'll get right into the interview with Lloyd. Here we go.
Hey everybody, Lloyd Hannison here. I'm the host of the PSP Podcast. If you ever wanted info on Sony's portable gaming system but didn't know where to start, why don't you give us a try? Each week we bring you the latest news from the PSP scene, as well as reviews on the latest games and accessories. As you may or may not know, the PSP isn't just for playing games. You can use it to watch movies, look at your digital images, and even listen to MP3s and podcasts. If you'd like to have a listen, we can be found on the web at pgrevolution.com. The PSP, it's a revolution in portable entertainment, but this time the revolution is broadcast.
PSP Podcast. Your revolution will be broadcast.
Lloyd, welcome to the show.
Oh, hey Rob, thanks for inviting me on.
And first question, and what was your first computer?
Well, I'll have to go with the old standard of VIC-20.
Back to the VIC-20s.
Back to the VIC-20. It was a pretty decent system, had the super fancy cassette tape recorder sticking out right behind it, so all my games were on audio cassette, so that was always a lot of fun.
What was the first podcast you listened to?
Well, that's interesting. The first actual podcast after the term was coined was the Daily Source Code. But I had been listening to a show, basically an internet downloadable radio show, so basically a podcast, since about 2000 called Retro Gaming Radio. It's basically just it's a video game show, but it's all about old retro computers and arcade systems. So he's been producing it for about 7 years now.
I'm a big retro gamer. I go to video game auctions here in Kansas City. I used to. I will start going now that I'm back. They have these auctions about every 3 months. It's great. They have the old games. You pick up an old Miss Pac-Man, a Centipede, a Galaga.
Oh, yeah.
And I used to go and I would buy 2 machines every auction, and I would sell back my previous 2 machines. So every auction, I would just, every 3 months or 6 months if I missed one, I would just turn over the machines I bought and get a couple new ones and then bring them home, like 1941 and great games like that.
That would have been a blast. We don't have anything like that up here. We have a couple old arcades still, but nothing like an auction. I actually ended up building an arcade cabinet for a MAME computer and had that up and running, but unfortunately had to dismantle it when we moved houses. It couldn't fit through the door.
Today, what podcasts are you listening to on a regular basis?
Every week, I'm listening to some of the tech podcasts that are out there, like Twit and Dignation and Gadget podcasts. I've been listening to that a lot lately. And always I listen to Inside Mac every day when it's posted. I'm sitting at work and it pops up in iTunes and I listen to that. And then I'm also listening to a couple game-related shows like Gamers Daily, which is a newer podcast that I just started listening to recently. It's just a bunch of guys using Skype and talking about video games. So it's a little bit of a lighter listen, not too much heavy content or game reviews. But
yeah. I heard you mention that one. It wasn't platform specific. It was just more gaming in general.
Exactly. It's everything from PCs. They talk a lot about PC demos. So if there's a new demo released by, say, Activision, they'll usually have something to say about that. So I find that pretty enjoyable. And when I'm sitting at work doing web work or some of the other stuff that I do there, I just like to have something on in the background that I can put my ears up when I hear something interesting and then just do what I do when it's not too interesting. I've started listening to some of the other ones that have been featured on iTunes, like the Mummy Cast and some of the other ones like that. I'll pretty much give anything a go for 1 or 2 episodes if I see it on the main page of iTunes.
Let's talk about your podcast a little bit. Go ahead and tell the listeners the format and what your podcast is all about.
So it's the PSP Podcast. So it's basically a weekly show dedicated to the PSP. So I cover game reviews, news. I have some other features that are sent in from other people that work on the website. And also my wife, Cara, does a weekly part of the podcast called The Scene, basically where she's doing previews of games that are going to be coming, usually within about a month or so, just to give everybody a big burst of news prior to the game hitting the stores.
Is Cara a big gamer also?
She is, actually. She plays a lot of the older games. She's not too much into the newer systems like the PS2 or Xbox that we own, but she loves a GameCube. She's actually upstairs right now playing Sonic Collection on her GameCube, so which is kind of funny. You sit there and you watch her play, and she's the most patient gamer that I've ever seen. She can fall down the same hole 50 times in a row, and it doesn't faze her, but I just get frustrated and have to leave the room.
Well, it sounds like you have yourself a little geekette there.
Yeah, it's great, actually. I like to tell people that our first date ended in playing Mario Kart. So any date that ends like that was a good date in my books.
What made you decide you wanted to do a podcast about PSPs?
Basically, once podcasting was starting to make it big and a lot of people are getting into it, I was listening to probably about a dozen podcasts around that time and brought Cara in, and she was listening to like the Daily Source Code or some of the other ones. And we like to talk, so we thought, hey, this would be something cool to do, but we could never think of something that we actually wanted to talk about every week. Basically, we put that on hold and just didn't touch it. And then we went on a cruise. We went on a Western Caribbean cruise, and we were leaving the day after the PSP was released. So being the geek that I am and probably kind of stupid, I actually went and picked up a PSP so I could take it on the cruise with me to play on the plane ride there and back, and just thought, wow, this is an awesome system. I love it. This is our podcast. I did a little bit of selling to get Cara interested in the idea, but that was basically all it was. And I had it in my mind to do a PSP news site, so just kind of a blog for reviews and news, and I thought the podcast would be a good way to make my site a little different than the other ones out there.
I was at Gnome Decks back in June, and Phil Terone had a PSP there, and he was talking about all the different hacks that there are for the PSP.
Yeah, there's a lot.
How do you keep up with all of them?
I actually had to pick up a second PSP because once you upgrade your PSP, you can't use any of the hacks that are out there anymore. So I have my original PSP that I bought back on release day that is still using the 1.5 firmware, and then I have a newer one which I upgraded to the 2.0 firmware, the one that has the web browser and everything in it. And I basically just have an RSS reader that alerts me of any new applications that are out there or new homebrew or anything like that. I download it, test it out, and write a short little review or a news piece for the website. So it's a huge time investment, but I like checking out all the cool things that people are coming up with.
Now, I noticed you were talking about not just software hacks, but hardware hacks, where you were going to be able to add in with some ribbon cables so that you could actually connect it up with S-Video up to a television.
Yeah, there's a new device that's going to be released probably within the next couple of weeks called PSP 2 TV, and it's done by a company, Team Extender, I believe they're called, and they were one of the Xbox mod chips people. So they were making mod chips for the Xbox. And they came up with this little device, or are coming out with this little device, that you open up your PSP, you connect some little cables inside, and you basically have video outs on the back of this device so you can play your games on your regular television. So I'm looking forward to getting that in the mail, hopefully in the next few days, I'm hoping.
Now, how is it watching a movie on the PSP?
It's not that bad. If you're not actually holding the PSP, it's a lot better. I tried holding my PSP for a whole flight and watched Spider-Man 2 that way. And not only was my neck sore, my arms were tired. So if you can get yourself a pair of external speakers or even just a case that doubles as a stand, it's actually a pretty decent experience.
From a content point of view, what are some of the things that you're going to be doing or adding to your show, or is there anything that you plan to change on your show going forward?
Well, it's kind of tough to plan ahead. There's so many games coming out where I want to devote a heavy portion of the podcast each week to the new game releases. I've actually even been starting to put out 0.5 releases, is what I call them, which is kind of a weekend wrap-up of game reviews. So I'll do an episode 24, and then I'll do a 24.5 on the weekend, which has a game review. I'm looking to add a lot more older game reviews. There's a steady stream of games that are coming out that I still haven't covered. So I want to do some audio reviews of those and get them out into the podcast. There's some other features that I want to start adding in. I've recently been playing around with user feedback, so trying to get user feedback each week for a specific part of the podcast. And I'm trying to integrate that more into the podcast. I find it easier to get word-of-mouth advertising if you have something to offer in the podcast where the users can have a say in it. At least that's what I've found lately.
What is some of the more memorable feedback you've received, or the more interesting feedback you've received since you've been doing the show?
Probably the most memorable that I received was there's a local new media group here in town called Manitoba New Media Group, and they put on monthly workshops on different things related to media, so video editing, audio editing, stuff like that. And they actually had me come in for a 2-hour podcasting seminar after hearing my podcast. They were looking for someone locally that would know something about podcasting, but they didn't know that they had someone that was an actual active podcaster here in town. So that was kind of neat.
Congrats.
Oh, thanks. It was just kind of out of the blue, so it really struck me as odd, and I jumped at the chance.
Can you tell listeners where to locate your podcasting website?
Sure. Well, my website is pgrevolution.com. It stands for Portable Gaming Revolution, which is my PSP news site. You can find the link there, and also the link to subscribe if you want to use a podcatcher to catch every week's episode.
If somebody out there has a PSP and they want to contribute to your show, how should they contact you?
Well, they can send me an email. There's a contact button right on the website. I'm actually looking for more submissions for like audio reviews or audio tips and tricks. It's something that I'd like to have as a weekly feature up in the podcast. So if any listeners have a PSP and want to do that, I urge you, by any means, send me an email and let me know what you want to do.
Let's talk a little bit about the production end of doing your show. Hardware-wise and software-wise, what are you using to put together your show?
Okay, well, I kind of did it the cheap route. I picked up a Mac Mini, and I'm using that as my main recorder using GarageBand. The Mac Mini doesn't have a built-in sound line in, so I picked up a Griffin iMic, and it seems to be working out not too bad. I'm not super happy with the quality. I'd like to get a better mic to use, but that'll come in the future, I think.
What's the best aggregator out there, in your opinion, for downloading podcasts and then transferring them to the PSP?
Currently, what I'm using is I just use iTunes, and I do the old drag and drop just out of my iTunes window into another folder. There's not a heck of a lot of aggregators made specifically for the PSP. There's a new one that was just announced about a week ago from when this was recorded called Media Boss, and it's basically a sync tool for your PSP. It allows you to pull in music from iTunes, images and pictures from iPhoto if you're using a Mac. It does video conversions as well. But it's a nice thing that they added into this version is a little podcatcher. There's no integrated browsing of like a podcast directory, but if you know the link to the XML file, you can add it in here. And every time that you sync your PSP, it'll look for new podcasts and dump them onto your PSP as well.
Outside of the podcasting community, where are you going out to promote your show? And I would imagine you're probably going out to PSP forums.
Yeah, I'm doing a lot of that. I post on a number of forums, and I have the link to my podcast right in my signature. Of course, the seminar that I did on podcasting was huge. I got a huge number of listeners that way, and then use that to help them create their own podcasts, which was kind of cool. But the only other thing I'm really doing is going around to different game shops, leaving flyers with my website address on it, just things like that. Pretty lo-fi stuff, just more word of mouth in town. And people that are on the forums, I'll ask them to do the same thing. And it seems to be working not too bad. Of course, the biggest boost for my podcast was when I was featured on the iTunes main page for about a week. I had about 5 times as many subscribers.
Are you doing anything right now to generate revenue for your show?
Not as much as I'd like to do. I'm actually, with the Google ads that are on my website, I'm actually paying for my hosting bills, other than the big spike of downloads that I had when I was featured on iTunes, which ended up costing me a bit of money. The basic week-to-week hosting charges, it's covered by Google ads, so I'm totally happy with that. I've thought about doing the sponsoring model where get a game company to sponsor the podcast, but that's really all it's been, is just me thinking about it. I haven't really actively pursued it. Not until I'm in the red for paying for hosting will I even consider that, I don't think.
What advice would you like to offer up to someone starting out a podcast today?
Well, I've heard it said many times on your show, just if you find something that you're passionate in, do a podcast on that. If you try to invent a show every week or every day like some people are trying to do, if you're really not interested or passionate about that topic, you're going to quickly find excuses not to record your podcast. So that would be my biggest bit of advice to a podcaster out there.
Well, Lloyd, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Well, thanks for having me, Rob. Hopefully you'll have a PSP soon and we can start chatting about some gaming.
Well, folks, that concludes our interview with Lloyd from the PSP Podcast. Lloyd, thanks so much for coming on the show. If you out there are at all interested in the PSP, if you have a PSP, this is definitely the podcast for you. So go over to pgrevolution.com and check out Lloyd's podcast. Well, at the end of today's podcast, we're going to play a promo from You Are the Guest. And we have some feedback following that from Paul over at Podcast Tools. If you have any feedback based on today's show, please call 206-666-4357 or send an email to podcast411@gmail.com. On our next show, we're going to have Bazooka Joe from the Small World Podcast as our guest, and that will be Wednesday, November 9th, so please come back for that. That's going to go ahead and do it for us today. As always, I'm your host, Rob, from Podcast 411, reminding you to listen different.
This is Bill Grady, the host of a new show called You Are the Guest. You Are the Guest talks to everyday people just like you and me about news, current events, and how they affect our everyday lives. We also dig into what your friends and neighbors are talking about, too. It's part talk show, part opinion poll, and part reality show. But we also have some fun with a word association game called Celebrity Square Root, and then we turn the tables with Ask Bill 3. That's where you as a guest get to ask me 3 questions about anything you want to. You Are the Guest wants to share with the world your opinions, and because of that, it is completely dependent upon your participation as a guest. For details on how to be a guest, just go to our website at www.youaretheguest.com. Thanks for listening, and I hope to be talking to you on a future edition of You Are the Guest.
Hey, Rob. Paul Culligan from podcasttools.com. Hope all is well. Pleasure hearing your 100th show today. I just can't get enough of that, and I just appreciate what you've been doing online and how you've given us all just a fabulous insight into the world of both the podcasters and then, of course, with today's show, the podcast listener. 100, I'm looking for the next 100. Looking forward to catching up with you at Podcast Expo. Again, congrats, sir. Bye.